Hello, scholars. This week, we are covering several topics. We're still introducing ourselves to ethnic studies, terminology, frameworks, methodologies. We're still introducing you to what ethnic studies is and how it performs and makes analysis of the world. And so today, or in this lecture, I'm going to cover quite a bit of the terminology that you would usually pick up during reading. Your student learning outcomes indicate several different terms that you should know and have the capacity to analyze and articulate. This lecture is an introduction to those terms and a few others that you may come across in your readings and videos from the class, and some you may not, but you should still have some awareness of and be able to discuss. So some of the terminology that you need to know or should be able to analyze, articulate, and analyze are the following: Eurocentrism, Ethnocentrism, which I did not include here, Anglicization, Americanization, white supremacy, hegemony, hierarchy, and oppression. You may have already been introduced to the terms hierarchy and oppression, so I've just given a quick definition of those. Hierarchy is a system of organizing people and things, but primarily people, in an arrangement that positions some above others to create power dynamics. Oppression is the result of an exercise of power over groups of people. Eurocentrism. You may have heard the term Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism has been variously defined as an attitude, conceptual apparatus, or set of empirical beliefs that frame Europe as the primary engine and artifact of world history, the bearer of universal values and reason, and the pinnacle and therefore model of progress and development. In some form or another, this entire class is a dialectic or a conversation between Eurocentrism and alternative epistemological methods. Epistemology means sets of knowledge, right? Or the theory of knowledge. So Eurocentrism is a way in which the dominant society frames how we know ourselves in the world, right? It's an attitude, conceptual apparatus, and empirical belief. So it is a part of how we think. It is a part of how we understand the world and the institutions within the world. It is a part of how we understand governing structures, and it frames Europe specifically as the primary engine and architect of the modern world. If you think about how you've learned history through this Eurocentric lens or Eurocentrism. And most of the times when you learn histories of other people, it often starts in our traditional historical accounting history. I call it history with a capital H. It often starts with the moment that Europe interacts with those groups of people, as if people don't have histories outside of that European interaction. History is told by the victors. I'm sure that you've heard that saying before, that history is told by the victors. And when the victor is telling the story, they're going to tell the story the way that they want to, in the framing that they want to. And so that oftentimes erases and divorces people from historical accounts and truisms that are outside of something that positions Europe and Europeanism in a positive light. In Eurocentric narratives, the superiority of Europe is evident in its achievements in economic and political systems, technology, and the high quality of life enjoyed by its society. Eurocentrism would suggest that if there is anything called progress, if there is any economic systems or political systems, any development of technology, that those started from from European thought, that they started from European understanding, and it was not informed by anything or anybody else. This is not true. Eurocentrism is more than banal ethnocentric prejudice. Ethnocentrism is when a person or a group of people looks at their own culture and their own ethnicity as a way to reference or understand other people's cultural practices, other people's behaviors, beliefs, and to create a kind of standard. It's more of a comparison, right? It's, okay, this is the way my group is doing this. This is the way that we practice our cultural beliefs. Let me examine how you practice your cultural beliefs. And sometimes that can absolutely create hierarchy. Sometimes that can absolutely be oppressive to other groups of people. It can be discriminatory to other groups of people, and it is still not the same as Eurocentrism. So this reads, Eurocentrism is more than a banal ethnocentric prejudice. However, as it is intimately tied to and indeed constituted in the violence and asymmetry of colonial and imperial encounters. And we'll talk about colonialism and imperialism in another lecture. Eurocentrism is directly tied to the global conquest and violent power of overthrowing other civilizations. Ethnocentrism does not do that. Eurocentrism is what makes this violence not only possible, but also acceptable and justifiable. So we see something like the colonization of some place in South America, right? We see the colonization of the 13 colonies in the United States. We see the colonization of Africa. And what Eurocentrism does is not only commit that violence, but it is what makes it acceptable and justifiable. So you'll get explanations about conquest that sound more like missionary work as opposed to conquest and violence, that sound more like progress. We're going to progress and help people become more civilized, as opposed to we're going to go and commit genocide in these places and steal their resources. Eurocentrism is a way that spins that narrative, colonial and imperial encounters, into something that is positive and frames the West in a good light. Significant critiques of Eurocentrism emerge in the context of post-World War II shifts in geopolitical power, including anti-colonial and anti-imperial revolutionary movements. So we started to think differently about, or at least started to look more closely at Eurocentrism. But even so, institutional practices that privilege whiteness and Eurocentric epistemologies continue to haunt the production of knowledge. This says in geography in significant and disturbing ways, because this was taken specifically from an encyclopedia of human geography. But it actually haunts the production of knowledge in all areas of study in primary education. So like I was saying, in some form or another, this entire class is a conversation between Eurocentrism and alternative kinds of knowledges, right? Or we will try to think with and through the impact of institutional structures that privilege whiteness. We're not talking about white people specifically. This is not about individual people. This is about institutional structures that privilege whiteness, or the concept of whiteness, right? Even in its unreality. We will examine the different methodologies and approaches that people of color have deployed to combat the realities of existing in such a system of ideas. Having a lens that focuses on Europeanness and Euro thought, being and belonging is not the issue. The fact that that is the only lens through which we study histories, through which we study cultures, through which we understand the world, that's the issue. So there's nothing wrong with looking at Europeanness and saying, let's focus on some of the ways that they do things. The problem that we have is that Eurocentrism tends to be the only way. It tends to be constructed as the proper way, the proper method, the proper mode of being, living, thinking in the world. Some of the ways that Eurocentrism manifests. Eurocentrism, again, is a way of looking at the world through the perspective centered on Western cultures and values. In his book, Orientalism, Edward Said defines Eurocentrism as the following: it is a way of seeing that is rooted in geographic, economic, technological, and political dominance of Europe and its overseas empires in the modern period. It is from Eurocentrism that we get the concept of otherness that Said draws our attention to, where there is a European way of being, and then there is the other way of being. Othering creates a system of hierarchy where Europe and Europeanness is situated at the pinnacle, at the point, at the height, and the others are outside of that. They are outside of belonging. This manifests in a couple of ways. If you think about beauty standards in the beauty industry, there is some changes and shifts in the beauty industry in more recent years, but still there is a centering on European identities as the standard of beauty. If you look here, there is oftentimes this representation of white savior figure and people of color. This is a Black man, this is a Native man, who are in his debt. At least this particular statue doesn't have them like kneeling down or at his ankles. There are a number of statues that look like that, but he's still mounted on this horse. He's still the savior and above these two other groups of people. This graphic is taken from what's called the white man's burden. During the period of imperialism, a part of the discourse or explanation for why there needed to be European dominance across the globe was that they needed to bring up the othered groups, the people who are outside of civilization. And the way to do that, that was the white man's burden. And so you see the Uncle Sam and whatever this European figure is carrying what's supposed to be groups of people of color on their backs to up the mountain to civilization. And then another way that it comes up is literally in our education. So behold your forefathers, and this is a group of people of color, and their forefathers are supposedly represented by this figure who is mirroring, even in the United States, and we'll talk about Americanism in a minute, even in the United States, or as the United States is developing, we see that the so-called forefathers of this country mirrored European justices and European political figures, not just in their dress, but in their modes of thinking and in their practices. So from Eurocentrism comes Anglicization. Anglicization explains the process through which the European colonies in the Americas emerge from their diverse beginnings to become increasingly more alike, expressing a shared Britishness in their political and judicial systems, material culture, economies, religious systems, and engagements with empire. Anglicization hinges on two powerful ironies. First, that the 13 mainland colonies had never been more British than they were on the eve of the war for independence from Britain. And second, that this shared Britishness, rather than a sense of American distinctiveness, enabled these colonies to make common cause in the revolution and the creation of an early republic. So Anglicization is a process. In the United States, it looks like mirroring the very nation that the developing United States was supposed to be separated from. In the entirety of its development, the 13 colonies copied the political and judicial systems of Great Britain. It was the system that they knew, and so it was the system that they mirrored. They copied the ideologies around culture and economic systems, religion, and notions of empire and the like. And that's how we get a Eurocentric discourse inside of the United States, right? This Britishness becomes central to American identity. And so we have the 13 colonies. I'm sure that you all were taught early on that the 13 colonies were originally settled by different groups of people, right? They did not all come from Great Britain, that there were a number of Spanish, French, different religious factions, all settled the 13 colonies. The Dutch, as the 13 colonies settle here on this supposedly new and discovered land, they start to align with a more British ideological system and become more Anglicized in their identity formation. It's from that Anglicization that we get an Americanization. The purpose of Americanization was to unify a culturally diverse people by obliterating ethnic identity and forcing the immigrants to rapidly divest themselves of values that were portrayed as antiquated and anti-democratic. And I want to point us to this one. Quote, the road to Americanization ran through Anglicization. In other words, before these widely dispersed colonists could develop a sense of their own common cultural identity, they had first to be integrated fully into the British Empire. So again, Anglicization explains the process through which the English colonies in the Americas emerged from their diverse beginnings to become increasingly more alike, expressing the shared Britishness in their political and judicial systems, material culture, economies, religious systems, and engagement with the empire. As the colonists develop a kind of shared identity and pick up an Anglicized or Eurocentric mode of thinking and being, we develop this notion of the United States and Americanized United States that we still demand of indigenous people. So if you look at this particular graphic, we have a cartoon with a group of diverse people who come through the United States and kind of become more cookie cutter, because there's an expectation that when immigrant populations come here, and only some immigrant populations are acceptable immigrant populations, but that when they come here, that they will change and acquire the language, political beliefs, institutional beliefs, and they will fold into an Americanized identity. Oftentimes, immigrants are asked to, are given the option, I should say, to change their name to something that's quote unquote more American, right? Oftentimes, I know that you all have heard, you're in America now, so speak English or something like that. So this leads us to our next topic, which is white supremacy. White supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system. Let me stress again, it is a system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and people of color by white people and nations of the European continent. Americanization is a form of maintaining white supremacy in white hierarchies. It's for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege that leans toward or privileges whiteness. Let me be clear on something here. I am not talking about individual white people, and I'll come to a little more of a nuanced explanation in just a moment. When we're talking about white supremacy, particularly in this class, and in many of the focus studies courses like African American Studies, Chicano Studies, Asian American Studies, we're talking about a concept of whiteness that really does not exist in reality. This is in no way suggesting that all white people are experiencing their whiteness in the same way, because this is a focus on a system, not on individual people. And so I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. The most common mistake people make when talking about racism, white supremacy, or white supremacy is to think of it as a problem of personal prejudice and individual acts of discrimination. They do not see that it is a system, a web of interlocking, reinforcing institutions, political, economic, social, cultural, legal, military, educational. It is present in all of our institutions. So I'm not talking about individual acts of racism, individual prejudices, individual moments of discrimination. I'm not talking about specifically white people. What I want you to get to in this class is understanding systems of power, to understand a system of exploitation, a system of oppression. And that unfortunately, many white people experience some of the same systemic exploitation and systemic oppression. Even though the system privileges whiteness, it does not mean that all white people are experiencing that privilege in the same way. And I'll talk to you more about white privilege, I think, next week. But this week, I want you to understand that these issues are not about individual people. They're about a structure, a governing system, an educational system, a religious system, a military system, a cultural system, economic systems that privilege certain groups or certain conceptualizations of race. We live in a racialized society, and as such, we're experiencing these racial hierarchies in particular ways, even though we're not experiencing them all at the same level at the same time. Hegemony refers to the dominance of one group over all others. It's an unrivaled power and can be used and can use their power to influence as influence over others. What I want you to understand about hegemony is that it is a way in which the dominant societies' ideas and thinking and values become a part of a normalized system. Hegemony is a way of understanding how dominant societies or a Eurocentric discourse becomes the norm and the standard, so that when we have a standard of beauty, we are looking at whiteness as the standard of beauty. Or when we think about the founding of the nation, we're looking at Jefferson and the like, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, as our forefathers, right? That whiteness becomes the norm in a particular way. There are different types of hegemony. I've listed them here. You won't have to know them in any great detail other than to be aware that there are these different types of hegemony. But understand that all of them are forced power from a dominant or more powerful group over another one. For example, the process trade hegemony is the process of influencing or forcing other nations to open their markets to your products or to your products. This can occur even when this represents a grave threat to the culture, the way of life, and the political stability of the nation. The United States forced trade on Japan in 1853 and in 1867. And it led to economic, social, and political crisis in Japan. So understand that the United States, particularly the United States, has practiced all of these forms of hegemonic power over another group of people, other nations and peoples. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about frameworks. Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'll try to do this for most all of your the people who you read with, because you need to understand who you're reading and what you're reading about. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor of law. She received her LLM from the University of Wisconsin, her JD from Harvard Law School, her BA from Cornell University. She focuses on constitutional law, civil rights, critical race theory, intersectionality, feminism, and the law. She is also a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is, I think she goes between both Columbia Law School and UCLA. So Crenshaw introduces this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality is a framework for thinking about how social markers, the ways in which we are categorized in society, places us above or below a line of domination. So a person who is a person of color or a part of a minoritized ethnic group would exist under the line of domination. It is usually or always connected to something that exists above the line of domination. So these isms, these genderism, sexism, racism, Eurocentrism, heterosexism, wealthism, disableism, educationism, ageism, politics of appearance, or beauty standards would be here, classism, language bias, colorism, anti-Semitism, pronatalism. All of these isms are the ways that we analyze this entire system, right? So intersectionality says that we all exist in the world, having been marked or mapped or defined in the world along these different social norms, right? So you can have, you can be a person of color, you can identify as male. So we have a person of color down here, but they identify as male. They are economically stable. So financial stability. However, they are a person who's differently abled. So they have markers or identifiers that exist above this line of domination and markers and identifiers that exist below this line of domination. All intersectionality does is identifies and shows that there are people who are experiencing people who are having different experiences in the world based on their social markers. So a person who a white person who identifies as a woman is not going to have the same social experience as a white male might have. People who are younger are not having the same experiences as people who are older, right? There's a way that we undervalue or devalue the social markers that exist under the line of domination. And there's a way that we overprivilege or overvalue these things here, right? The things that exist over the line of domination. Intersectionality is not saying that, is not accounting for all of the ways that you experience oppression or marginalization. Intersectionality is saying these are the different ways and modes of being identified and labeled in the world. And so there are parts of you that will be experiencing privilege, while there are parts of you that may also be experiencing oppression and domination. Examples of social identity categories and social group members. There's race. This is a terrible visual. You can see it a little clearer on the PDF, but not very much. I should have fixed this. Race, Black, white, Asian, Latino, Native American, multiracial. Sex, male, female, male, intersex. Gender, man, woman, transgender, gender queer. Religion, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Mormon. Sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual. Class, owning class, upper middle class, working class, and poor. Ability, disabled, temporarily able body. Age, elders, adults, young people. So these social identity categories, the ways that we are fit into like boxes really in society, and there's no judgment around this. This is literally how we as human beings make sense of the world, is that we create social identity categories. We try to fit things and people into small boxes so that we can make sense of all of the chaos and multiple sensory stimuli that we're experiencing. So there's nothing wrong with these, inherently wrong with these. What happens is when these social categories are placed as something that is within a normative society and something that is othered or exists outside of a normative society, that's when there's a problem. It's when hierarchies and power dynamics are created through those social categories.